I just wanted to welcome you. I'm Ellen Lust. I'm the director of the Analogy Center. I can someday learn to say that more fluently. Anyway, I am super excited. You know, there's these things that sort of make your heart happy, and this is one of them. It's great to see you all here. It's great to see everybody back on campus generally, but it is especially great to see you here, and it's great to have this panel. Because one of the things I think that's exciting about Einaudi is that we have, on the one hand, sort of, you know, kind of area studies depth with sort of various sort of regional programs and some great programs in migrations and peace and conflict studies that kind of go across the globe, if you will. And that means we're able to bring together, you know, exciting sets of speakers from, you know, across the globe, or who can represent and discuss sort of what's going on with regions across the globe. And so I'm particularly grateful to Rebecca Slayton. She's the director of the Peace and Conflict Studies, and when she mentioned that she was going to hold this panel, as you can tell, on peace, security, and the presence of the U.S. in the world, you know, it was at a director's meeting, and everybody's eyes sort of lit up, and you could tell that, you know, it sort of was really about something that meant a lot to everybody and has a lot of different ways in which it's impacting what we're doing, what we're thinking. I was then excited to see a lot of the programs coming together. And for this, I actually have to look down, which is amazing because it means how many different programs we actually have. So basically, the Repi Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies, of course, has led the charge, and again, very grateful for that. And I also can't really see anymore these days. Migrations program led by Katie Fiorella, the Institute for European Studies with the director Mabel Berzin, the East Asia Institute with Nick Admonson as the new director, Latin American and Caribbean Studies with Alex Nading, Institute for African Development with Rachel Besner-Kerr, and the Southwest Asia and North Africa, or SWANA program, which is our newest program led by Seema Glastana. So just excited to see sort of everybody coming together to address something that's really super important. And then I don't want to sort of miss the fact that, as we all know, most of us don't do nearly as much as work to sort of get something like this off the ground as those who are behind it. So a special thanks to Patricia Young and to Aidan Kelly for really great work in putting this together. So thank you. Take it away.
Okay, thank you, Ellen. So, my name's Rebecca Slayton. I'm the director of the Judith Repi Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies, and I'm jointly appointed in the Department of Science and Technology Studies. And I'm delighted to see all of you here today. I'd like to start with a reflection on changing attitudes towards U.S. engagement in the world. So about 30 years ago, Madeleine Albright, who served as U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations and then U.S. Secretary of State, began calling the United States the indispensable nation. And this phrase flattered U.S. audiences into supporting a variety of U.S. interventions in the world. The notion of an indispensable nation captures the ideal that the United States should be a force for good in the world, whether through military interventions or humanitarian aid. Of course, this narrative of American exceptionalism is also exceptionally problematic, not only because it implies that other nations are not indispensable, but also because U.S. interventions have had sometimes horrific consequences. So Albright herself eventually regretted that she helped block United Nations intervention in the genocide in Rwanda. And the United States had a long history, of course, of overthrowing democratically elected governments and selectively supporting dictators. So even in interventions which might seem obviously beneficial, like distributing food and medicine to some of the world's most poor people, has always been driven in part by an interest in projecting U.S. soft power, not pure altruism. So today, the notion of the indispensable nation has run its course, not because U.S. leaders have learned humility. The current administration certainly embraces American exceptionalism, but in a more baldly self-interested, America first kind of way. So in the first months of the Trump administration, U.S. humanitarian assistance to much of the world has been cut, and U.S. military and economic alliances with many nations are in question. So which of these changes is welcome in light of historic U.S. abuses of power, and which are dangerous in light of the potentially positive effects of U.S. interventions, is of course a matter of ongoing debate. The goal of today's panel is to explore how these ongoing changes to U.S. foreign policy are likely to affect issues of peace and security in several regions of the world. And we're honored to have a very distinguished group of experts with us today. They each have deep expertise in the cultures and politics of particular regions. So I'm going to begin by introducing each of them briefly. Professor Jacques is professor of anthropology at Syracuse University. He specializes in security, governance, democracy, and development in South Sudan and Sudan. He has also written extensively about gender, sexuality, and reproductive health, humanitarian aid, ethnography of political violence, gender-based violence and war and slavery, and the politics of identity in South Sudan and Sudan. He is the co-editor of the Sudan Handbook, published in 2011, and the author of 4 books, including most recently Breaking Sudan, The Search for Peace, published in 2017. Kaya Schilde is Associate Professor of International Studies in the Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University. Professor Schilde's research focuses on the political economy of security, with a particular emphasis on defense industry politics and the political development of the European Union. Her first book, The Political Economy of European Security, was published in 2017, investigates the state-society relations between the European Union and interest groups, with a particular focus on security and defense institutions, industries, and markets. Zhang Wang is professor at the School of Diplomacy and International Relations at Seton Hall University. His research focuses on 3 interrelated areas. First, identity-based conflicts, nationalism, and the politics of historical memory. Second, peace and conflict management in East Asia, with a special focus on China's impact on regional peace and security. And third, foreign domestic linkages in Chinese politics and foreign relations. He's the author or editor of 3 books, including Never Forget National Humiliation, Historical Memory in Chinese Politics and Foreign Relations, published in 2012, which received the International Studies Association's Yale H. Ferguson Award in 2013. Finally, Diego Chavez Gonzalez is the senior manager for the Latin America and Caribbean Initiative at the Migration Policy Institute. His research focuses on forced displacement, legal pathways, integration, migration and development, and regional cooperation in migration management. He previously worked for the World Bank and the United Nations. While working for the United Nations, he helped develop a strategy to involve victims of conflict and internally displaced persons in the peace deal negotiations that ended the Colombian Civil War. And since the start of the Venezuelan crisis, he has assisted Latin American governments in developing policies to integrate arriving migrants and refugees into receiving communities. So we'd like to keep today's format very conversational. We don't have 4 mini presentations. What we have is some questions that we've agreed to discuss. I'm going to start by directing questions to individual panelists to address specific regional issues, and then we're going to move to some cross-cutting questions, talking about some issues that cut across different regions. And I'll direct my first question to Professor Wang. So yesterday, the Chinese government commemorated the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II and the end of the Sino-Japanese War with a military parade and other ceremonial events. And leaders from many nations were invited, including North Korea, Iran, Russia, and many other Asian nations, however, but not Japan, South Korea, or traditional US allies in East Asia. Last month, of course, was also the 80th anniversary of the US dropping atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the few survivors left from that bombing have expressed concern about a growing arms race in East Asia. So can you discuss a little bit what is driving that arms race? Nations like Japan and South Korea have been building their military capability for quite a while now. To what extent are their current investments being driven by concerns that the United States might not be a reliable ally? And to what extent are they driven by other factors, domestic politics, other regional issues?
Thank you, Rebecca. Good afternoon, everyone. It's very happy to come to Ponera, and I can see the beautiful views outside the window. So I hope beautiful views makes beautiful ideas. Yes, like you mentioned yesterday, China conducted a major military parade. I actually recommend, if you haven't watched it, you can watch it. If you Google, you should find about the longer and shorter versions of the video of this parade. It's the full version is 1.5 hours. It's really something. Chinese President Xi Jinping standing in the middle with Putin on his right, Kim Jong-un on his left, and another 26 leaders from the different countries gathering in Beijing, and China demonstrating its most advanced weapon systems, including intercontinental missiles, which they can reach every corner of the world. It's really something. And it's not just a ceremony or commemoration, because yesterday is the official victory day for the China-Japan war, and it's the date Japan officially surrendered 80 years ago. And it's important strategic message. China trying to send messengers to many different parties, especially United States. So President Trump got it. He made a comment. I just watched the news today. He said it's impressive. And he said China's purpose is to let him to watch it. He said, I watched it. So I think China trying also to send the message of its determination, readiness, resolve over issues like Taiwan, South China Sea, sending messages to many different parties. And Rebecca, like you mentioned that there's like I mentioned, many of China's neighboring countries attended. So including, China has sharing borders with 14 countries, and 11 of them attended this event. But none of the countries with military alliance relationship attended this event. So like Japan, Korea, Philippines, they didn't attend this event. So I think for this parade, it's providing us several angles or several perspectives to understand I think that you asked a very important question to understand the changing geopolitics and changing, the local landscaping in the East Asia and Asia more broadly. I think for the Asian leaders, there's two major challenges to them, maybe keep them awake in the night. Is that first is how to deal with rising China. Compared with the rest of the world, European country, African country, Latin American countries, Asian leaders can feel the rising of Chinese power, China power, the military power, the made in China, the personnel, everything more closely because they're close to China. The second challenge to them is how to deal with the changing foreign policy of the United States. Currently, I think the Trump administration mainly focuses on Ukraine war, Gaza, Iran, rather than East Asia. So it's a relatively peaceful area, peaceful period of time. But people are somehow awaiting for big storming coming. And also, this administration's more transactional approach towards the diplomacy and the different countries make these countries, all these countries in this region, they became quite nervous about, they don't know it's unpredictable what's going to happen. So, like you mentioned, there's a major arms race in this region, major arms race. It's unthinkable arms race. So China's military parade actually is showcase China's development in recent decades, especially following some of the technology breakthrough China managed to complete in recent decades, especially recent several years, and has been contributed to the military modernization. So some military experts even claim this is causing some paradigm changes of, balance of power in this region. And because there's a kind of like a policy vacuum of the United States, nobody knows Trump administration's China policy. East Asian policy. Nobody knows Trump administration South China Sea policy, you know. So people are waiting to the further development because currently I think the Trump administration for this region, focus on trade issues, tariff issues, rather than security issues. For another thing, adding the major complexity of this region is just like this event. This is a commemoration of 80 years anniversary. To some extent, we should say, World War II never finished in East Asia. All the East Asian countries still living under the shadow of World War II. There are still 3 reunification issues not resolved in this region. Chinese leaders keep talking about China is the only major country in the world. They still realize its national reunification, the China-Taiwan. We know 2 Koreas. Even for Japan, there's also unresolved Northern Territory issues with Soviet Union and Russia. And there's an not completed reconciliation. It's not like Europe. World War II is already a memory. For East Asia, the reconciliation has never realized. I can just sharing a public opinion poll number to you. A recent public opinion poll shows that 89% of Japanese holding a negative impression towards China, and 84% Chinese also has negative impression towards Japan. And this number has always been that high. So reconciliation has never really realized. I actually just published an article for this anniversary. I used the title, Memory as Destiny. For this region, memory or history is indeed a kind of destiny, and it's being weaponized for China. That's the reason China preparing so long for this parade, because domestically it's also using this historical memory as ideology. To some extent, like I mentioned, in East Asia, history is weaponized. So this made the situation even more, complicated. And like I mentioned, because of this, the Trump administrations, now they focus on other parts of the world. So the regional countries, they are hedging, they are reassessing. That's also one of the very important reasons, going back to your question, I think contributed to the major arms race. The arms race is, people, I just talked with the economist, they just, half jokingly saying that if you want to have a piece of investment advice, you just go to the East Asian countries, whether the stock markets of China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, you buy the military stocks, you won't lose. Because all the companies, they're making money, there's a major arms race. I just give you one number. Japan, they made a very ambitious plan to increase their military budget. So they have 5 years plan. So in 2022, 3 years ago, their military budget is 5.4 trillion Japanese yuan, but their objectives is 5 years later, in 2027, they want to increase it to 8.9 trillion. So this is 65% of increase. And for Taiwan, recently one of the senior officials of Pentagon openly asked Taiwan to increase its military budget from 2% to 10%. So you can find of this kind of a typical security dilemma in East Asia, this kind of unthinkable arms race that in all the countries, because they are uncertain about what's going to happen. You probably read articles calling Taiwan the most dangerous place in the world. I recently organized a conference in Taiwan. I can feel that people in Taiwan, this kind of anxiety about they don't know what's going to happen, because you read all the news about 2027 is China's the year of the, to launch the war. There's all the different kind of the estimation and all the different kind of simulation. People are trying to thinking about planning for this possible war. So finally, I want to offer my last point is that to some extent, I think this military parade somehow, like I mentioned that Asian countries, especially East Asian countries, they can feel China's rise more closely. And this parade somehow indicating there is an emerging bipolar system in this region. For other parts of the world, it's not really a bipolar system, but in this region, just like this parade, you can say which country are coming to attend this event, which not attending. You already say the divisions in this region. So there's emerging bipolar systems. But I think maybe we should, normally when we talk about bipolar systems, we talk about the possible, even higher possibility of conflict between these two superpowers. But if we look back at the history of the Cold War, we can also say maybe the bipolar system will make any power, any country more cautious of possible conflict. So there may be a higher possibility of the Cold War rather than hot war. And also, just like the military parade, China's official statement of this military parade is somehow trying to say, oh, we're doing this not for the purpose of showing strength, it's for the purpose of making all the parties to be more cautious, to be more cool-headed about the possible, possibilities of out of control or escalation. We hope the future trend goes to this way rather than like many people talking about the possibilities, especially the scenario about 2027 or those kind of discussion and narrative. So I think I will stop here and yeah.
Great, thank you very much. So
Thank you.
We may return to some of these issues later. I want to make sure we have time for discussion at the end, so I'm going to reserve that. I'd like to turn now to Europe, which is another region where there's a lot of concern that the U.S. alliance is not reliable with Europe. And if I can ask Professor Schilde, now that many European nations are concerned about this, what are the prospects for European defense without the United States? What does that look like?
Thank you so much. So I really appreciate this question. It's huge, and I'm going to try to distill it down into a few different themes. I just want to first say that I'm going to answer this question I'm going to directly answer your question about European security. And some of my answers have implications for global security that might be different than European security. And so I'm aware of that, but I'm going to answer it in a very Eurocentric way, okay, about European security. And that is the question of how Europe can defend itself from the threats it perceives in the international system, right? So I just want to come out of the gate saying that, because I recognize that when I say this and answer it in a certain way, it's very Eurocentric, but I'm aware of that. So the bottom line, basically, is that I am, in the medium and long term, completely unconcerned with Europe's ability to defend itself, meaning generate defense capabilities, have a security community, not be part of US structures if it doesn't need it, or take over US structures if the US exits. So I sleep like a baby at night in terms of thinking about Europe's ability to defend itself in the medium and long term. I do have concerns about short-term complexities, specifically around complex interdependence when it comes to especially weapon systems, and the fact that European states bought so much US defense equipment over decades, but in particular since 2022, since the start of the Ukraine war, which has implications, and then particularly under the fact that the Trump administration has shown the willingness to use some of those dependencies and weaponize them, right? So short-term, major concerns, long-term, no concerns. And the reason why I have almost no concerns about European security doesn't have much to do with NATO at all. I see NATO as a robust institution that has endured, even though most of the time it shouldn't have, based on different interests and crises and things like that. And it may not endure. It might have just been a legacy of the 20th century. But my answer about European security, why I think in the medium to long term it's so robust for Europeans, has everything to do with the EU. And so that sometimes surprises people when I say that, because a lot of the public discourse about the EU is that it's feckless or weak or has failed in security, or there's a lot of language and discourse about that. But I study states and state authority as a political scientist, and when I look at the EU, I see an institution that looks a lot more like a state in its authority than an international institution. And then if I'm having a back and forth with an imaginary person about this, they may say, oh, sure, Kaya, maybe in terms of regulating fisheries or something, but not defense. And I say, no, I mean in particular in defense, actually. And then that's the provocative argument that gets me in trouble. And so we might have someone push back on me in this room, and I welcome it. But the reason why I say that is because I think that the EU, even without an EU army or the EU directly buying military equipment yet, it is a little bit, but not historically, or without robust military operations or a nuclear capability, I think it looks a lot more, it's comparable to other 21st century states in how they generate military capabilities than not. And so the reason I say that is because what it means to generate military capabilities has changed. Most of the time when people say, oh, the EU is not a security state or does not have state-like powers in security, they say, oh, well, it's not taxing its population to generate a standing army and buying equipment or building that equipment for that army. And so unfortunately, we still have hot wars with armies and everything, but the way states generate the equipment for those is very different than it was in the 18th or 19th centuries or 20th century. Currently, states that are not direct combatants in war, their biggest issue is generating military equipment in complex domestic international supply chains that are managed and run by the private sector. These are defense contractors and defense markets that are not the state. And so the EU has a lot of that authority, market authority and regulatory authority, to shape those private sector actors, is one of the arguments that I've been making lately. And over the last 20 years, this regulatory authority of the EU over defense has only been increasing. And this is not, I'm not making a separate argument for the EU. This is also how, let's say, the US government generates defense equipment. It does not have military arsenals where the state makes equipment. It has not taxed its population to fund a war since the Korean War. It generally it generates equipment through defense contractors that are US actors that rely on complex international supply chains and cooperative international production agreements. And so this is a common challenge that the US faces, that the EU faces, and the EU has a lot of that authority. And so this is not new. This is not hypothetical either. The EU needs more authority in the medium and long term, specifically to be able to fund more defense through debt and to relax some of its restrictions around industrial policy. But the EU has been incredibly robust already as a regulatory actor in defense. And that there's evidence there. EU defense firms, because of this, because they get signals from the EU. The EU is not buying the equipment, but they get signals from the EU about what to buy, what kinds of standards might be there, how competitive this space might be, how likely they are to sell in the future to European states. They invest huge amounts of their own profits on innovation and R&D, more so actually than American firms, and this is always, people don't believe me, more so than their own governments. So let me just repeat that. In the year 2025, and for the last 20 or so years, the private sector is the one that spends the most money on future defense equipment than the public sector. And this is also true in the United States. So if this is new information to you, if you haven't really heard about the EU's role in defense before, you might be wondering how it got that authority. There are two explanations for this. One is something I documented in my first book, which is that defense firms in Europe lobbied for the EU to get defense authority. It's kind of a market explanation, a supply-driven explanation. Some people have said it's a little bit Marxist as an explanation. And because firms wanted there to be greater market protections for their future profits. The second reason that the EU has defense is a classic security studies reason, because European heads of state and EU officials perceived international threats and also at key times were worried about US retrenchment or US willingness to be involved in NATO, and wrote in greater future defense authority into EU treaties. Now, people have looked at that and said, oh, but the EU hasn't done much with it. But my point is the EU is already doing as much as other states in defense, in markets, and it has that legal authority. And that legal authority is there because of perceptions of threat in international systems and the international environment. Even in the 1950s, Jean Monnet and his compatriots, his contemporaries, created European defense community because they were worried about the Soviet Union and developments in the Korean War. The annexation of Crimea in 2014 is what led to a host of defense instruments and authorities that the EU has today that they were able to actually activate and operationalize in 2022 because they already had them. They were already there because of key officials and actors perceiving threats in the international environment and building that into EU capabilities. Now that brings us to the Trump administration as an existential threat. And this threat, the one that you hear about, the one that we hear about the most, is about NATO and the US, whether or not it will be good for its NATO guarantees. That is a major issue. The one that I think is the greater short-term threat is about weapons systems. European states bought into US weapons systems for a long time, but particularly, I think it increased by 80% in the last 3 years, which is a huge, huge change in interdependence of Europeans on the United States. They did it to fill short-term capability gaps, which is one of my greatest concerns. The thing I would watch for is the Trump administration essentially threatening. There's been some discourse about them threatening to turn off the software. I'm skeptical that that's possible technically, but they very much can do regulatory warfare against European states in terms of them being operators and managers of these defense platforms. In terms of training, licensing, supply chains, they can turn a lot of things off on the Europeans. And this is a major short-term problem that I'm watching carefully and working with others to think about how the Europeans can build resilience. But the thing is, in the long term, European states have always wanted to build more defense equipment in Europe. It's been the Americans who have convinced or cajoled or bullied Europeans into not doing it. And those things have additive effects. The more you build weapons at home, the more political economy support you have for those weapons and for defense. This is what people call the military-industrial complex in the United States. The quote that the F-35 is built in every congressional district in the United States entrenches and builds in a structural level of support for defense. So that's another reason why I see European security in the long term being fine, because the more Europeans onshore that equipment, the more entrenched the political economy and the interest group support is for defense. Wash, rinse, and repeat. So.
Great, thank you. So, so I'd like to talk a little bit now about some historic U.S. partnerships in Latin America. So a recent congressional report describes Colombia as, quote, the closest U.S. security partner in Latin America and the Caribbean over the past 25 years, end quote. And Colombia and the United States have partnered on a wide range of issues: counter narcotics, counter terrorism, pro-environmental, environmental support efforts, migration. However, Colombia is also still struggling with the aftermath of a long civil war, and of course, partnership with the U.S. is in question under the current administration. So, Diego, could you please address how changing U.S. policies are likely to affect issues of peace and security in Colombia or other Latin American nations? I know that's a really big question. I know you will tackle what you would like of it.
No, thank you for the question. And I guess that in recent years, I've become more of a migration, quote unquote, expert. And that's where most of my work has been focused on. But I did play some role, as you mentioned, during Colombia's peace process. I worked with the World Bank's Fragility, Conflict, and Violence. So I'll try to do a bit of stretching of those muscles a bit in trying to answer this question. And actually, in fact, Colombia's experience, as you could arguably say Ecuador's, Guatemala, and some places of Mexico as well, sits precisely at the intersection between peace, security, and migration. So even when I speak about migration today, those dimensions are never far from the conversation. And actually, if you want to talk about successful integration policies of, Venezuelan migrants in Colombia, you need to talk about peace. And if you want to talk about peace in Colombia, you need to talk about this relationship between Colombia and Venezuela, and Colombia and the Venezuelan migrants as well. So there are a lot of combining factors in all of these elements. A bit of history. The modern U.S.-Colombia relationship really took shape in the mid-1990s when Washington decertified Colombia after a president that we had, Ernesto Samper, was accused of financing his campaign with drug money from the Cali cartel. So this was after the aftermath of Pablo Escobar. There was another cartel, the Cali cartel, and they financed Ernesto Samper's campaign. And out of that rupture came Plan Colombia, which was launched by our president, Andrés Pastrana, and President Bill Clinton in 1999 and 2000. And what began as a counter-narcotics initiative later then evolved into one of the most significant U.S. foreign policy efforts in the Western Hemisphere. From there, every administration, Republican or Democratic, conservative or liberal, sustained the support, whether through Plan Colombia or one of its successors, of this type of U.S.-Colombia relationship. President George W. Bush expanded Plan Colombia under the global war on terror. President Obama supported Peace Colombia, which was like a development of Plan Colombia for the 2016 peace accord with the FARC rebels. And during the President Trump's first term, actually migration was particularly important in Plan Colombia's efforts to address the Venezuelan migration crisis. So this was also added to the bilateral agenda. The US Congress has played historically since the late 1990s a decisive role throughout consistently allocating resources because lawmakers on both sides of the aisle understood, or have for a while now understood, that Colombia is at the heart of the Western Hemisphere, and it's a geopolitical and a geostrategic anchor. So if Colombia is destabilized as a country, it affects the entire Western Hemisphere, the entire region. The current moment today, Colombia faces a surge in coca cultivation, up to 50% more from this year, from 2023, with over 250,000 acres of production of cocaine, raising a lot of questions about whether Plan Colombia was a successful strategy or it wasn't. But regardless of that debate, in Washington, once again, decertification is on the table. It's under serious consideration, and if it goes forward, bilateral aid could be cut by half or even more, costing Colombia hundreds of millions of dollars in security and in institutional support. The ripple effects would extend, however, far beyond just the money that would be cut. We could see banking restrictions, we could see visa bans for officials and disruptions in trade with the United States, which is, of course, Colombia's biggest trading partner. And politically, it would undermine the trust and the cooperation that have been the bedrock of this sort of like US-Colombia alliance for the last quarter century. On the ground, the consequences would be felt, I would think, most acutely in rural regions. State presence of Colombia would recede, armed groups would expand, and the current President Petro's total peace strategy, which is already very, very fragile, would lose a lot of credibility. And even beyond the figure of the president himself, that very notion of peace in Colombia risks losing credibility now that Colombia is entering an electoral process and an electoral cycle next year. No candidate today, I think, could actually campaign on the promise of peace and expect it to resonate well with the public, particularly, I mean, private sector, but with the general public right now. And I believe that there is a paradox in all of this. Both President Álvaro Uribe, who was president at the time when George W. Bush was president, and President Santos, which was president when Barack Obama was president, they were opposites, but they grasped one essential lesson that from previous processes, which was how important territorial control was in Colombia. That was a non-negotiable. And Plan Colombia was actually based on trying to get and capture a lot of territorial control of the Colombian territory. Whether countering terrorism or achieving peace without territorial control, the state cannot succeed, and Colombia would be unstable, and therefore the region would be unstable as well. Petro, I think, our current president, has, for the most part, overlooked that very valuable lesson that we've learned through many years of our, 60 years of conflict, by attempting to negotiate with different, the paramilitaries and the guerrillas, and this group of guerrillas, and this group of non-organized crime, multiple armed groups. The government has really stretched itself way too thin and lost a lot of ground that was recovered through Plan Colombia. Violence is fragmenting. New actors are currently emerging right now in the Colombian territory. They have expanded beyond the Colombian territory, so we see the choneros in Ecuador, which are an extension to some shape or form of that violence in Colombia. We now have the ELN and the former guerrilla, what we call the FARC dissidents, with whom President Santos negotiated peace in 2016. So those dissidents are part of a bilateral guerrillas that are operating in Colombia and are also operating in Venezuela. And the communities once again feel abandoned. Displacement is also at a high right now. I want to say 25% of our population in Colombia, a population of 50 million, is a victim of the armed conflict, and we have about 7-8 million internally displaced, depending on where you get the data from. And I want to bring in a little bit of migration to this point, because Colombia today is simultaneously a country of displacement, internal displacement, transit, reception. As I mentioned, nearly a quarter of our population is displaced. 500,000 Colombians have left Colombia in the past 4 years, which is a lot. Many to the United States, also to Spain, to Germany, to the UK. Some of them because of clear international protection issues. I mean, they are actively asylum seekers in other countries. Others are abusing the asylum system as well in other countries, and they are trying to get better economic opportunities as well. But I think all of it has to do with the fact of how we've lost a lot of territory and a lot of ground in terms of implementing our peace deal. Remittances are at a high. I think it's 3.5% this year of our GDP. which is more than coffee. So we're coffee makers, and a lot of people know us as the cafeteros. We, the diaspora, are more important in terms of GDP than coffee itself. And we've also seen another couple of patterns that are very much invisible inside Colombia, at least, which is 5 million people crossed their territory the last decade, going like Venezuelans going to Ecuador, to Peru, to Chile, to Brazil, to other countries, and 1.2 million people in the last 3 years, from 2021 to 2024, crossed the Darien to come to the United States. So we are living in an era of human mobility here in the Western Hemisphere, and Colombia is a clear example of that. And this connects directly to the US policy. Congress has already approved $170 billion for immigration enforcement. To give you a little bit of a perspective on that, from 1985 to 2024, the US Congress allocated $180 billion for immigration enforcement. So for only this next 4 years, $170 billion, which will translate into large-scale deportations in the coming years. And without well-designed and well-funded integration and reintegration systems in countries like Colombia, we risk an eroded country, an eroded region facing coca production, conflict, migration pressures, and armed groups all at once. So the stakes are clear. Under the second term of President Trump, the United States has announced steep reductions also in financial support for Colombia, as it has for many other countries, after shutting down USAID and other important programs that are important for Plan Colombia, or whatever deviation of that program might be. And this matters enormously because Colombia has historically been the second largest recipient of US assistance after Jordan. So receiving about, last year, I think it was close to $1 billion. But for 2025, that figure has dropped, and it will continue to drop for the coming years. So I guess that whatever decline started last year, it would only look worse next year, and especially if desertification happens, it will be worse. What Colombia and the US relationship need right now is a kind of Plan Colombia 2.0 or 3.0, I don't even know what version we are on right now, that revisits both the accomplishments and the failures of the past. Did the war on drugs succeed, or did it fail? I mean, we need to ask ourselves that type of questions. And updated strategies, the goals for the short, medium, and long term. But the challenge right now is that President Petro and President Trump have been political adversaries from the start. In week 1 of the second term of President Trump, Colombia refused to receive deportation flights from Colombians, and Washington immediately threatened with tariffs and other sanctions. And this type of dynamic has continued and has made cooperation way much harder. And this is happening all in the context of an electoral cycle in Latin America, with Colombia itself heading, as I mentioned, into elections next year. The next stage of this partnership will depend heavily on whether the US and Colombia continue to see each other as allies. Pragmatism, I think it's essential right now, because I think ideology alone is more likely to divide the two countries, no matter who wins the Colombian election. Even if the right wing in Colombia wins the election, I think we will have ideology conflicts with the United States. And in the meantime, I think that while Washington waits for Colombia's electoral process to unfold, both governments need to find an opening to set clear, realistic targets for cooperation. If the certification moves forward, which I think it will, it could take years to rebuild the trust, and that is why laying out a route right now to stabilize and eventually renew our relationship is so important. Thank you.
Okay, so moving now to Africa, and particularly Sudan, which is currently in the midst of a civil war. It's caused what the United Nations officials call the world's largest humanitarian crisis. So according to a recent report, about 25 million people, I think last night we heard it might be 30 million people, are facing extreme hunger. 4 million people are internally displaced, and about 8 million have migrated to 7 different neighboring nations that are also in need of humanitarian aid. And just to put that 25 million in context, that's roughly half of the population that's basically starving. So the United Nations is among several nations that have tried to have some role in helping to broker an end to the violence. Its approach has also been criticized at times. So Professor Jock, can you tell us a little bit more about the history of that conflict, what role the U.S. has played, could play in helping bring an end to conflict?
Thank you for the question. Let me just say at the outset that currently, at least since the first Trump administration, the U.S. has retreated almost entirely from Sudan, and for the most part from the rest of Africa, except for the military bases, the AFRICOM in the west and the military base in Djibouti. Other than that, the U.S. has sort of completely retreated from, at least diplomatically, even though there are still business ventures in Congo. But the countries that are most affected by conflict in Africa are the countries where the U.S. has the least interest. And that is also announced in a rather off-color language from Donald Trump. And the only interest that the U.S. has in Sudan is not because of Sudan itself. The U.S. is interested in Sudan on behalf of other countries, mainly Israel, using Sudan as a surveillance, the Red Sea as a surveillance base on behalf of Israel over the Middle East, and Egypt because of the waters of the Nile, where the U.S. and Egypt are the closest allies in the region. Egypt is only second to Israel in terms of U.S. support. So whatever affects Egypt is a national security issue for the United States. In fact, Trump even told Egypt to blow up the dam in Ethiopia, the Great Renaissance Dam, which the Blue Nile feeds more into the main body of the Nile, and 65% of the water going to Egypt comes from that. And so if you build a dam on it, there's fear that it's going to reduce the amount of water flowing to Egypt. And Egypt being a country that relies exclusively on the waters of the Nile because it has no rain, this is life and death for Egypt, essentially. And that is why U.S. is interested in the region. Now, put the current conflict and civil war going on in Sudan in context, you can say that this war, which is now its second year, is only one episode of multiple wars that have been going on in Sudan going back to 1955, sometimes off, sometimes on. But the first war was about a conflict between North and South. When Sudan became independent in 1956, the first country on the African continent to gain independence, war broke out a few months before the independence between the North and the South. The South didn't want to be part of the Union, and it fought for its independence ever since, only gaining independence in 2011. During that war, the U.S. was always an ally to Sudan because of the geopolitics of the Cold War. U.S. is, democratic as it is, has a love affair with dictators in Africa because of the support that these dictators give to the national interests of the United States, particularly mineral resources and oil and all that. But this war the two countries, Sudan and South Sudan, that emerged out of the first war became independent because of a kind of agreement that was reached to say that instead of insisting on a country, one country, Africa's biggest country, insisting on its unity at the expense of it being ravaged by war, it is better to split it and have two countries that have a chance to live in peace and harmony with each other. And that is what gave birth to two countries. But instead of peace, both countries plunged into their own respective civil wars, mainly because of the war that they shared. And the remnants of that war have remained as a weight on both countries. But most especially because of their own internal dynamics and complexities. The two countries are in war as we speak. In the case of the Sudan's war, there are two moments you can point to as the triggers of this war. The first moment was in 2003, when South Sudan was planning to secede. The people of the West, a region called Darfur, very huge region, thought that the succession of the South is now going to turn them into the New South. That the things that Sudan government, the armed forces of Sudan government particularly used to do in South Sudan, they are now going to transfer those to the New South, which is the southern borders of the remaining Ram state. And so they went to war to try to assert themselves in terms of participation in the power sharing and the resource sharing and not being excluded from any gains that will accrue from the separation of South Sudan. And that war produced a genocide, which is what was very well known in America. American colleges were campaigning. There was something called the Stop Campaign to try to pressure the government of Sudan to stop these massacres in Darfur. The massacres were a result of the violence being outsourced to tribal militias in the West, Arab militias in the western part. They were the ones now who are being armed in order to carry out the job of the armed forces of the national army. The reason they did that was they wanted deniability of genocide. The Sudan government will say, it's not the army doing it, it's not the government doing it, it's tribalism, it's tribal militias. People hate each other over there, it's not us involved. So it was, even then, President al-Bashir got indicted by ICC and remained a wanted man until the second trigger of this current war came, which was 2019. There was a popular revolution in Khartoum, which overthrew the dictator, Omar al-Bashir, who had been in power for 30 years. When he was overthrown, the army got involved in that revolution and kind of hijacked the people's revolution. And now the militias that had been given carte blanche to do what they did in Western Sudan, and the real Sudan armed forces became the National Army of Sudan at that time. But they disagreed, and they fought among themselves and split into two. So you now have the Sudan armed forces under one general, and then you have something called Rapid Support Force, which was a militia the Sudan government had recruited to do the violence in Western Sudan, but now they are fighting each other. That is the war today. And the result, the consequence of this war are what Rebecca was talking about. The displacement, the humanitarian crisis is bigger than any other crisis we have seen in the last decade. Perhaps even worse than Gaza. And you wonder why it is not on your TV screens all the time the way Gaza-Israel situation is. And the reason, of course, is that the U.S. has no interest in this war. U.S. doesn't see any losses to itself from this war. And then came the suspension of U.S. aid, USAID and all the NGOs that used to give aid to these people. This is now the worst thing that could have happened to Sudan, not just because of the resources that USAID was sending into Sudan through NGOs and through UN, but mainly because of the loss of witness. The U.S. has essentially denied itself the capacity to witness the atrocities and the destruction that is going on there. And the U.S. has denied itself the knowledge that it could have used to intervene in terms of the search for peace. So I think what is going on in Sudan is only a part of what the U.S. is doing about Africa, which is to say, strategically, there are only locations where you want to be. Economically, there is not much to have from Africa. Even more economically, there is so much U.S. money that goes into Africa, and we don't see any results from it. It's not cost benefit. It's not beneficial to the U.S. to keep sending all this money, and therefore, of course, the first to be withdrawn was USAID in Africa, and of course, it's now the whole institution is dead, and that died with it are all these people who used to benefit from the aid that went in, most particularly in terms of health. The children who are dying and starving in Darfur today would have been spared if the money was still going on in. But now the disease, the malnutrition, when children are wasting away, there is no, it's not just the food that is going to be a problem now. It's all the other diseases that are opportunistic to a hungry body. And so starvation, every day we are hearing large number of children died or dying. Then last week came the mudslides, the hills of Jebel Marra in Western Sudan received torrential rains for days and days and washed the entire hillsides down with the people who live there. And nobody is going to a rescue. There is no international rescue missions going into the region at all, both because of insecurity, but also logistically, nobody has the money to go, nobody has the equipment, and it's a place that nobody has much knowledge about from outside. In order to even venture into it, you would have to do studies, how to avoid conflict, how to avoid falling into these violent situations. And so Sudan is simply just going to, instead of a country that was supposed to now be peaceful, now that South Sudan is gone, is now a country that is witnessing threats of complete evisceration as a state, as we know it. Thank you.
Very sobering. Thank you. So I wanted to ask some cross-cutting questions, but what I really want to do is make sure you all have an opportunity to ask your questions. So we're going to turn now to questions from the audience. Put up a hand if you would like to ask a question. I will be happy to call on you. All right? And please introduce yourself when you ask.
My name is Brian. I'm actually a Southeast Asianist here. And I actually have a question about Latin America, right? There was a big bombing of the boat just off the coast of Venezuela.
Can you speak up just a little bit?
There was the bombing of the boat off the coast of Venezuela earlier this week. And in the wake of that, people have started to take note that the U.S. military is congregating like a bunch of naval apparatus off the coast of Panama, and people have speculated that the U.S. has an interest in starting a conflict in Venezuela, a larger conflict in Venezuela now. I'm curious how likely you think that might be, but also the repercussions it would have around that whole region, the United States and Venezuela.
You take a few, or?
Well, why don't we go ahead and start with this one? Other people put up hands anytime, and I'll make a note of your question. But yeah, go ahead.
I was just discussing with Professor Shildi about this specifically, and it's weird what happened with that boat. 11 people doesn't resonate well with the dynamic of, for instance, drug trafficking. I mean, usually these boats that are used for drug trafficking carry 2 or 3 people at the most, specifically because one extra person might mean 75, 80 kilos less of cocaine. So what happened there is a little bit difficult to, I've been having difficulties understanding what that is. I mean, 11 people killed at a boat, that doesn't resonate well. I actually was listening to a radio station in Colombia the other day, and there was this retired drug dealer who said, like, that doesn't make any sense. Like, if you're doing that, you're not an expert on drug trafficking. So it is something that for me, it's been difficult to trying to put a pin on it. And I heard from Professor Shildi this morning that maybe, Maduro is claiming that this was probably something that was arranged, like AI arranged by the Trump administration, and that it didn't really happen. So that part, I would say that it's difficult to understand what's going on. I don't think that an intervention in South America is something that South American governments are going to want to promote. I think life, we cannot forget that life is important, and the Venezuelan diaspora has not forgotten that life is very important, and that many of the family of people remain there. So I don't think that this is going to be necessarily the outcome of all of this. To be honest, I just think it is a strategy to flex the muscle, to say that they're doing something to contain the number of drugs that are crossing the Caribbean Sea or going on their way to the United States. this will create a tension that will escalate, but I don't think it will escalate to the point of an armed intervention in Venezuela. I may be completely wrong, and if I am, please apologies. Over the next couple of weeks we will know, but yeah.
Thank you. Noah?
Yeah, so my question is to Professor Schilde. Yeah, so you seem very confident about the potential of EU to defend itself. And I am wondering from what kind of aggression, maybe Russia, but to what extent can EU defend itself from maybe China? Yeah. And my second question is to Professor Joe. What role is African Union playing in all this that is happening in Congo, Sudan?
Do you want us to answer them directly?
Yeah, well, actually, since we are short on time, why don't we group them all? Okay. So, I'm sorry, in the very back, I don't know your name, please.
I'm Fran Rosenfeld,
Oh,
Department.
of course, yes, I do know that.
So thanks very much first to all the speakers. I have a question for Kaya, and it's to ask you about, for me, the contrast between your optimism about the EU's ability to mobilize its private sector defense industry and what I think is generally the image, reality of sluggishness, to put it nicely, and mobilizing defense production in support of Ukraine over the last 3+ years. And so ask you to help us sort of reconcile those two images. Thanks.
One more question, please.
Yes, so my question is to Professor Wong, and it's about Xi Jinping's recent purge of the PLA, and specifically with its strategic missile forces, and what role does that play in China's position in the Pacific?
Can you speak a little bit louder?
Yeah, so my question is about basically Xi Jinping's purge of the military, and how does that play into China's strategic decision making?
Maybe we can just, sorry, is there another question? Oh, yeah, please, yeah.
I'm sorry. My question is to Dr. Kaija. I know you mentioned that the budget for the private sector budget for military in Europe is much higher than the government itself, and that made me think about, because the purpose of the private sector is to sell weapons more and more to the global south, and they're not really the military complex industry in Europe is not Europe centered. It's actually global south centered. So in that regard, in that perspective, how do you think global south will play a role within the Europe militarization defense mechanism system stuff? Thank you.
All right, last question, and then we'll go to, answers.
Hi. I'm so sorry to also ask a question to Professor Schilde, but I was very interested in the topic of, the increasing independence of the EU's military complex. I think it's a really relevant topic for the present day especially, but I'm curious as to what extent they can actually do this in light of the US sort of pushing back on this trend. Take, for instance, Trump sort of pressuring Ursula von der Leyen to import more military weapons from the US as opposed to building its own industrial sector in this regard. Curious to hear your thoughts.
All right, I think we should go to some answers or responses. Can we start with you, Kaya, and maybe we'll just move across?
Sure. I'll try. I did not keep track, and I apologize if I dropped the ball on one of them. But the question first about what is the threat, right? That's a fascinating question. It's definitely Russia, right? The perceived threat, right? I'm not going to adjudicate whether it's real or not, but it's the perceived threat is Russia, which by itself is so fascinating because rewind the clock 10 years, and that was absolutely not the threat. I mean, the EU has had military missions for 20 years and had about 38 of them. They were all completely around peacekeeping or extraterritorial forces in places where the EU was concerned about stability. And because the main issue around European defense was migration, preventing migration by trying to increase stability in its near abroad. So that's how European security was framed for a few decades. And then it's been reframed about the territorial defense of Europe against Russia. China is an awkward, non-securitized element. European security right now is very much regional, not global, even though part of that conversation has been power projection abroad through European states and European forces. But China is a partner in this, in European minds, in helping Europe bolster itself, even though current diplomatic things are going the opposite direction from what Europeans might imagine. Its allies and adversaries looking like, but it's absolutely about Russia. And so then the other question, so Global South and how do we reconcile this kind of structural strength, I would say, or latent structural strength with potential weaknesses? I would say absolutely there are weaknesses in European defense. It's got a massive interdependence and dependence on the United States, weapon systems, but what's interesting is if you actually look at the data, not pushing back on you, I'm pushing back on what we think of as conventional wisdom framings. European states have spent 150% of, or 50% more than the United States has spent in both military and non-military aid to Ukraine, right? It is actually bigger than what the US has spent. That doesn't mean it's not devastating to have the US pull back or pull out. This is a huge short-term problem. But it's the Kiel Institute of International Affairs has amazing data on this, when the conventional wisdom, policy, journalistic, is a little bit different than the reality. And the EU is the third largest spender on defense in Europe. It used to be the fourth before Brexit, but right now it's surging. So there is material reality to this strength. It's not just all hypothetical or latent, structural power or something like that. There are huge gaps, right? Industrial policy gaps, debt spending gaps, but the trajectory is going in one direction, and there's material reality behind it. And even things like the United States has been the actor holding Europeans back in terms of things like missile targeting. The British, the French all wanted there to be missiles that went further, into Russia, and the United States was the actor holding Ukrainians back in terms of the conditions around that aid. In terms of the Global South, yes, absolutely. That's why I said at the beginning of my talk, what's good for Europe is not necessarily good for human or global security. Just wanted to make sure I didn't look like an absolute idiot in my remarks framing it in that way. But what's interesting is defense contractors believe they need a certain amount of profit, right? They either get that from their home government or they get that from abroad. And one of the things driving arms exports from European states to the Global South has been the decline in European government spending, because they have felt that they need to get their profits from somewhere else. So what's interesting is the EU is helping those firms increase their profits in order to keep them stable. But I'm not trying to be all Pollyanna, like everything will be fine. But one of the interesting things is if they start selling to the EU or some kind of European authority, they might actually stop dumping equipment to the Global South. So that's one path. I don't know if that's the path, but that's one possible path. And then I apologize, I forgot the last question, but we'll talk at the end, and I don't want to take up more time. So.
Professor John.
Yes. Yeah, I think the best way to think about the role of the African Union is to see Sudan as a kind of a microcosm of the Afro-Arab relations. Sudan stands astride the geographic divide between the Sahara and Africa south of the Sahara. And the result of this is a kind of identity crisis among the Sudanese, where instead of heeding calls from African Union, they would rather go to Saudi Arabia or UAE to mediate their conflict. They are more interested in, and so the Middle East and North Africa, as it were, are sort of the pen holders on Sudan and not the African Union. In fact, the African Union has proposed possibilities of a ceasefire, so that at least when there is ceasefire, you can now you save lives and then sit down and talk peace and talk real peace. And the parties in Sudan have refused, mainly because the Sudan Armed Forces and Burhan, who is the head of quasi-head of state now, is not happy with the African Union, because many African countries have invited the head of RSF, Hemeti, to come to their capitals and received as the head of state. In fact, there are two parallel governments in Sudan. So the Sudan government is not accepting the role of the African Union, because they suspect the African Union is in support of the other side. And I think that is the difficulty. But in the end, what is going to give is for the warring parties in Sudan to agree to a kind of a ceasefire, so that at least you can reduce the death, you can give room for humanitarian intervention, and then make room for peaceful negotiations. Thank you.
Last word.
Yeah, so we talked about the military parade, and indeed a lot of discussion is focusing on China's intercontinental missiles. And compared with United States, China has much smaller nuclear arsenals. So for many years, China has been focusing on this improving its delivery systems. So that's the reason they focus on the development of missiles. And actually, recently, the Secretary of Defense has openly talked about China now has the capability to destroy American aircraft carriers in 15 minutes. He mentioned this is mainly to blame the Biden administration is incapable of military development, but he's talking about this. So basically, I think I'm just trying to say that, as I mentioned earlier, that in East Asia, because there's no security mechanism, not something like system like NATO, like EU, and also the historic issues. So make this region that, especially with the change of the policies, with rising of China's power, so almost every country is preparing for war. So that's the situation. That's one of the consequences you can say this kind of arms race, because there's no certainty, especially the current administration is making deals on everything. So people don't know, for example, Taiwan is talking about what kind of price maybe the administration will consider to make deal with China over Taiwan. So those kind of discussion makes all the countries, they focus on the military development, including China, so they're preparing for the worst scenario of military conflict.
Thank you. Well, I want to say thank you to each of our panelists again. I have learned a tremendous amount from each of you. I really appreciate you making the visit. And thanks to all of you for hanging in till the end.
Thank you.